the topic that you and I have talked a lot about, and you stand in the middle and laugh at us, is really who owns resources as we start deploying in the cloud. When it's on-prem, it was a little easier because you didn't have to go get physical servers that had to be the infrastructure guys. But the process in the cloud about when can a developer go stand up a Lambda or go stand up a database gets to be sort of blurry. And I think some of our more senior developers on projects want to go do it all themselves because they can connect this Lambda to that Lambda and not have to worry about it.
Well, I think they have a lot more expertise in that cloud environment than maybe they had in a traditional data center or on-prem data center. They certainly have more access.
Well, they have more access, but it's also, like the AWS tools are built to make it easy.
Sure.
And there's plenty of go Google for this. And since they have the permissions, they can go do it.
Well, permissions are key. And obviously those can be restricted or, taken back a little bit. So they can't create anything that they want. But just the knowledge, I think there's a broader knowledge of the cloud and the cloud ecosystems by developers these days than maybe there were once upon a time with the internal on-prem data centers. And maybe it's because, I don't know if it's new, exciting, whatever, but the idea of more traditional approach to infrastructure handled the data center and did everything in the data center. And the app dev teams were creating code and developing applications, and whenever they needed something from infrastructure, they went to infrastructure, and infrastructure did it because they knew they weren't going to be able to do it themselves. They didn't have the access or even maybe the interest to do it. But with cloud, I think that kind of loosens things up a little bit, and people are a lot more knowledgeable in that ecosystem than they might have been on traditional data centers, and they can do this stuff, and they have the ability because they can spin up their own instances up their own subscriptions to it and play with it at home, and they're used to doing things like spinning up various, be it servers or any kind of other cloud resource.
Miss stuff when they do it because it's too easy. Like they don't account for security.
That's the problem. You hit the nail on the head. It's too easy.
Right.
Because the developer can open up their tools. Their tools give them access to all the major cloud vendors. All the cloud vendors have SDKs and things that abstract everything that's in their environments. So to a developer, they can open up an API, create an API. After a couple hours, they can connect to a cloud, say, I need a Lambda, click a button, Lambda spun up. They click another button, their code's deployed. In their minds, that's all you have to do. Now, the reality is your group, there's a bunch of things that you guys do to protect the business.
And that's almost like what works on my laptop.
Right.
It's the same sort of...
But it's even easier now than it was, 20 years ago. Because, 20 years ago, it was similar, but you didn't have the power of the cloud.
And where do you draw the line between something that is, traditionally infrastructure or was traditionally infrastructure in the cloud now to things that are more related to the application? You're talking about, a Lambda in AWS. Is that, do I consider that infrastructure? Do I put it on par with, VPCs and subnets and things like that?
I think that's what IT has to figure out, and that's where we're kind of stuck right now.
Right.
Is all of this is new. No one understands how we really should be doing it. So every organization is trying to figure out what's the right way to approach it. I think as we go forward, we'll eventually figure out how to take all those policies and things that need to be there to protect the business and codify those so that when a developer says, okay, I need to create this type of application, when they do so, there's going to be a bunch of rules that are laid on top of what they're doing to help satisfy you. But it's going to take a while to get to that place to mature those processes so that stuff is baked in.
Even back up to a simple example of Lambda. So I look at a Lambda and I don't care what's in it, but I want it inside my VPC, assuming I have data I want to protect. I want limits on its ability to scale. I want logging of what happens in it. I want all those things to happen. I don't actually care what it does as long as that box. But from a developer, they think they should just be able to go create a Lambda on the fly. But if they create on the fly, all those things get left out. Now, you're talking about a super mature model. I'm talking about today.
Right. But that's where we got to figure out how do we split the difference and get to a place where that stuff eventually winds up in there. The controls are put on the Lambda so it doesn't go out of control.
And I think from a DevOps standpoint, because a lot of companies that are struggling in the cloud, they have one big environment and everything is ClickOpt. that they go, somebody developed it, said, hey, that's works, let's copy and paste it, let's put it in prod and call it prod. And you almost lose your release process because the infrastructure components, the making the Lambda, sticking the code inside the Lambda and, database or whatever become a very manual thing, or they lose even their, what impact is this going to have? What is this going to tear down or create? I mean, the whole thing sort of falls apart.
If we can get away from the ClickOps aspect of building things out in wherever, but cloud in this case.
But I think ClickOps should never be done for the upper environments. But I think it's very hard for developers and infrastructure people, especially getting started, getting the maturity journey. How am I going to make this work?
It's a good start. So I think it very much has a place in the beginnings of anything that you're trying to do. Especially if you're trying to spin something up quickly and kick it around and whatever. There are things that don't really lend themselves well to automating or don't provide value in taking the time to automate something. And the idea of ClickOps to be able to spin something up manually, kick it around a little bit and understand, yes, this is what I was looking for, this is what I want to do, and then go back to the automation side and spin it up through some other tool is a decent approach for doing that. And when we talk about infrastructure, and I'm still on the fence around things that are more in the infrastructure realm versus the app dev realm or even the DevOps realm for ownership and responsibility. We know we can put guardrails in place to make sure we don't hurt ourselves or the company. We know that we can put limit access to certain things so that those different teams don't have full access to the entire ecosystem. The DevOps, the automation part of it makes things consistent. It's visible for people to see and understand how things were created, and kind of weigh in on, don't create it this way, create it that way, or connect to a VPC or don't connect to a VPC, and keep some consistency about it. But in the end, we still have something that needs to be managed. So this infrastructure as code, whether it relates to an application and building out the components for the application, or the infrastructure where it's the VPCs and the subnets and the like, those might be two different departments running or owning those things. It may be infrastructure owning those networking aspects of the cloud, and maybe app dev or DevOps owning the application resources and automation around that. I don't see it as infrastructure owns everything just because it's in the cloud. You provide the governance and the structure, and we have to adhere to that, and we make sure things are in place to make sure that happens.
A lot of that goes with, where does DevOps live? I mean, we've had arguments internally about,
Sure.
Are infrastructure and DevOps the same people? Are they in their own group? Are they, part of the more development? I think that's a huge topic in itself. But using infrastructure as code for the entire cloud ecosystem, I also have struggled with recently, because we spend so much time creating infrastructure as code for components that are never going to change. Like, I get the argument of, if I've got Lambdas or even databases without data in the one, having infrastructure as code makes sense, because I can make them the exact same dev QA on up through prod. Mm-hmm. But things like the VPNs and the routing tables between all the VPCs of your different environment or your different accounts if you're using Control Center, but I mean, those never change. So the hundreds of hours that we spend arguing.
It depends on what you're building, right? If you're building something that is small and local, then yes, it may never change. But if you're going to build a solution that you may extend around the world, I would think if you're doing it right and you create that infrastructure as code, you may deploy it into a couple regions in the US. You may want to take that blueprint and drop it in Asia, in Europe, and other places. And then all those things just become variables to adjust.
Like the connectivity to on-prem, or the connectivity between them wouldn't be, you almost couldn't do them as infrastructure as code, because you have on-prem sides things to them. You have routing tables based on what IPs you get assigned. Now, it's good to have them in a tool so you can do a delta on them, make sure no one drifted, nobody did anything, but the actual work of building them.
But some of those things the developers are going to worry about.
I'm not worried about the developers, I'm worried about the infrastructure people.
Well, never's a long time, right? Ever and never are
right.
Two things that never come to be. But the idea of, it's never going to change. There are things in that networking aspect, we're gonna add a routing table. We're gonna add a subnet. We're gonna change the CIDRs for something. We're gonna do something to the environment that we would normally do through, clicking some buttons, that we can now manage through code. And where the changes are infrequent, I would agree with that. There are still some other benefits to having it as code, represented as code, for things like BCDR. We need to spin up this over here now. We should be able to take that, or at least as a blueprint, take that, spin it up the entire environment and be up that much quicker. Or we want to add another environment. We have dev test, dev QA, stage prod. We want to add UAT or 3 other environments. We can do that now.
Right, you can stamp out that blueprint, but even I would have to spend a lot of time with our friend Rick to be comfortable with the infrastructure as code tool pushing in a routing change.
Right. I mean, that's where you have to figure out how you're testing that, right? Because the other thing that comes with infrastructure as code is automated testing, which is something we don't do now.
Right.
And that gives you the ability to verify that stuff in ways that we can't do today.
Right, but most of that testing we would be doing on the application, on the upper side of it. Would we be?
I would
we're
think
probably
you would
not
want to vet
testing.
the infrastructure, right? Because first thing you're going to do is spin up the infrastructure. Why not have a suite of tests that verifies the infrastructure works as we want it to work before you deploy code in?
And there are some aspects of that we were doing now as we were spinning up some of this infrastructure on the networking side of things, where we're like, is this a public or private subnet? Well, test it and make sure it truly is public or private. Did we get out to the internet? Yes or no? Okay, pass fail. It worked for us. And we're doing those tests manually after we've stood things up through automation to do all that. But you're right. I mean, we can implement some automated testing around that to make sure things are working as expected.
Because you're going to eventually define policies and best practices, and there's no reason you can't wrap testing around some of those things.
You absolutely could. I'm just thinking like, okay, we're deploying SD-WAN at this client. That is something that we would do very manually because of all the level of testing that would have to be done for it, the routing, redundancy that we want. Not that we couldn't come back and add it to Terraform. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't see trying to push that level of changes from an infrastructure code tool into a production environment. It would make me very nervous.
Well, if you're going to do it once, but if you think you're going to do it 100 times.
But most of the foundational VPCs, networking, all that kind of stuff, even the security groups, you're building them once.
And you never would want to tear it down and start over?
If you tear down the core VPC to it, everything in it goes away.
Yeah. Right. And that's one of the benefits of cloud is you can click a delete, and it's just how much work do you want to put into that environment, and what do you want to delete? Do you want to delete everything, or do you just want to delete the stuff inside of
You
it?
delete the VPC, you delete everything inside that.
Right. Well, and if you think about going back to,
So you check the never delete button.
we talked about being able to spin up other environments and such, but if we ever get to a point where you want to spin up and tear down rapidly and for testing purposes or whatever, or project needs, because our new project, this long running project, needs its own environment dedicated to it so we can do stuff,
That'd be great.
then we're going to run this code.
Right.
I think there's enough
Even if you have to go
value in it.
manually go back and fix the networking, you'd get 99.9% of the components in place.
Right.
And then you just have to stitch it in.
Yeah, and some of the work that we did for things that may change infrequently but are as important as what we did automate were for reasons like that. And I think that...
Well, one of the things, the reason I still am a fan of it is because it gives us the what do you think is there and what is really there.
Yes.
That's super valuable.
Mm-hmm. And what was there yesterday? And I want to go back to yesterday.
Right.
Yeah. But I
We'll
still
make you a believer.
Well, I'm mostly a believer, but I mean, in the infrastructure, when stuff like that changes, it's very hard to go back,
Manually.
even automated. Because either way, the stuff like that shouldn't change. So why did it change?
I'm going to go revert it to yesterday, tomorrow.
Did our public IPs change? Are you reverting those too?
No.
Well, then how do you know the routing table is going to be right?
Because I've got tests that will test it.
No, we don't have those things. Because the lack of testing that exists on the application side, the infrastructure side is the last one.
Well, and really the idea was just being able to go back to a point in time, just like with any code base.
Right.
Right. So it provides a very responsible, very repeatable way of being able to do that. I would trust that way more than I would somebody going back in and
Oh,
click
absolutely.
copying.
I remember the client where Brian works,
Yeah.
where they had an oops in their infrastructure as code tool. And, to be able to run the scripts back in was the only way it could be done. To try to manually go back and do that, I mean, that's why ClickOps is bad, because you can't remember the 9,000 steps you did to get it to work the first time.
It's not bad. It's not good enough. It's not the complete answer.
It's not a long-term picture for
Absolutely.
a continuously evolving platform.
Sure.
Right, but at some point, you're going to make some decisions on the tooling you're using. And I would hope that the way you operate in year 1 is very different than the way you operate in year 10 versus year 20, right? And that over time, those practices become more mature, and hopefully
I'd say you're different
introduce
year 1
automation.
to year 2 to year 3. I mean,
Well, yeah.
5, 10, 15 seems like a pretty long time.
Well, so it depends on the place, right? I mean, to get to where I'm talking about, where you're testing everything, it may take you 10 years. And where the first few years you're focused on the development side of it, and then you transition to putting the automation in place to test in your world, because that doesn't exist today.
Right.
And who would even, if we were going to turn a light switch on, who would even begin to do that work?
Right.
Are it going to be your guys, or is it going to be my guys, or it's going to be QA folks? And then what are we teaching those people? Because if you go grab a normal QA person, they don't know anything about.
Right. I mean, that's a whole different thing about does QA know what they're testing.
Right.